Right? Michael Jordan is one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. Straight up, just one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. This collection of video here is just him missing shot after shot after shot, right? He can't even slam the ball in the net. Those particular actions, him missing his shot, does not define who he is as a basketball player. What defines who he is as a basketball player are his habits, what he does over and over and over again. We're going to say that in the moral life, what defines who you are, what defines who I am, are my habits. My habits are my stable qualities or dispositions. In other words, I'm not defined by my particular actions. I'm defined, what makes me up are my habits. That defines who I am. So what we are going to get into with this Test C stuff, and the reason I wanted to just do a video on this was that way it was all in one place. We've done some of it virtually, we've done some of it in class, so I just wanted to give you a chance to look at this stuff together in one place if you needed to for our test next week. So a habit is going to be that abiding quality. It's a quality that you have that characterizes who you are. And Aristotle gives us the first conversation on this in ancient Greece, centuries before Jesus. And then in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas is going to pick it back up and Christianize what it is that Aristotle writes. And we still use the language of these two guys today. So a habit is going to be a disposition or an inclination in the moral life. In other words, the more I tell the truth, the more I'm disposed or inclined or lean towards telling the truth in the future. The more I cheat, the more I'm disposed to, the more likely I am to cheat in the future. I'm inclined to do that because that's what I've been doing over and over and over again. So when we talk about habits in the moral life, right, we're not talking about like, oh my gosh, he chews his fingers off, right? Or, oh my gosh, he taps that pen, it's so annoying. Or, oh my gosh, cigarettes are bad for you. We're not talking about habits in that sense. We're talking about the characteristics, the traits that make up or define who someone is. In other words, habits are the more stable qualities of a person rather than just particular actions. So you think back to the Jordan stuff. Yeah, he did miss those shots. He's missed some pretty big shots throughout his career. But the more stable qualities, the more stable characteristics is that he's a guy who hits shots. He's a guy who knows how to win. He's a guy who can perform in the clutch because he does that over and over and over again. So there she is, right? Waiting for the husband to come home. He's always on time for their Thursday night date night, right? If he's late one Thursday for the first time in 3 years, she's going to think to myself, oh my gosh, that's not like Doug. Right? In other words, Doug is late in this situation, but he's not the sort of person who is late. In other words, what defines Doug is not this particular action, but what he does over and over and over again, which is someone who's on time. Right? So I get this buddy, maybe you've heard me talk about him in class, Steve. And Steve is like the cheapest guy ever. We actually call him Stingy Steve. And we were out with Stinge a few weeks ago getting some appetizers. And he says, guys, this one's on me. So Stinge picks up the bill. He's still cheap. Right? Even though in this particular action, right, he's being generous, he's still the type of person who is cheap. And we all thought to ourselves, oh my gosh, that's not like Steve. In other words, Steve isn't defined by this particular action. He's defined by his habits, right? This is essential. The good news is that even though he is still cheap, that is changeable. In other words, Steve can go from stingy to generous, but he needs to build the habit of generosity. He would need to build that habit over and over and over again until he became someone who's actually generous. So in this section, what we want to do is just briefly talk about how it is we can obtain habits, right? So let's use, for example, getting healthy. All right, where is he? There he is. So let's take this guy, right? Let's say he goes to Hendricken. Let's say he wants to put the hot dog down. Maybe he's been enjoying them a little too much lately. He wants to get healthy. The first thing he's going to do is overcome the contrary habit. So, he's going to get off the couch. He's not going to start watching as much TV. He's not worrying about exercise, right? He's got to get over those contrary habits. So the first step to obtaining habits is to resist, right? In other words, I have to go to the gym because I want to get healthy. The second part of building a habit is repeating it. You do it over and over again until it becomes ingrained in you, until it becomes natural, until it becomes like a second nature. And the third step is actually you respond to it with pleasure and promptness. In fact, that if you stopped exercising, you would feel that something was off. If you didn't go for that morning run, you would feel like, oh my gosh, something's off today. And the more you do it, the more you repeat it, the more you actually begin to respond to it with pleasure and promptness. So how do I know if I've obtained a habit? When you start performing the habit effortlessly, it becomes ingrained in you. It becomes part of you, and you actually respond to it with pleasure and promptness. So for instance, when school starts, you've been sleeping the days away throughout summer, right? How great it is. And then that first alarm of the year, right? The first thing you're going to do is resist staying in bed. The second thing you're going to do is repeat responding to that alarm day after day after day. And then eventually you'll respond to that alarm with pleasure and promptness because you have obtained the habits, the characteristic of responding properly to when the alarm goes off, right? It's same with guys playing hockey, right? Those early morning practices. Eventually, when you repeat it over and over and over again, when you resist the urge to just, let me stay in my warm bed, then you actually begin to respond to it with pleasure and promptness, right? The same is even true for firefighters, for guys who work, right? Maybe the job at first is really difficult, but they repeat certain actions over and over again. It becomes part of who they are. And then actually what they're able to do is respond to calls with pleasure and promptness because it's become ingrained in them. Right? So eventually, right, what Ryan's able to do because he resists, he repeats, and he responds is he's actually able to get healthy. To the point where if he doesn't run, right, something feels off about his day because it's a habit that's ingrained in him. We're going to say that in the moral life, the same is true for being brave, telling the truth, being patient, being generous, being loving. Right? That actually I can do those over and over again to the point where I can respond truthfully, generously, lovingly, patiently, with pleasure and promptness. Because I've resisted, I've repeated, and now I'm able to respond. So even though Stinge pays the bill, he's going to have to resist his stinginess next time. He's going to have to repeat his generosity until he can then respond to paying bills with pleasure and promptness. When it becomes effortless, that's a great way to know you have the habit. Dramatic pause. We also need to note here that it's not just an external thing, but it's also an intentional thing. So habits are going to have to do with not only what I do with my actions, but also how it is that my intentions inform who I am. So Stingy Steve not only needs to do acts of generosity, he needs to have the intention to want to be generous. In other words, his action of generosity needs to be driven by the intention. So for instance, I have this friend, Gina. I call her Generous Gina. She's been a friend for a long time. And whenever we go out She'll sometimes pay the bill. She has a great job. She's able to do this for us. Jean is always the type of person who gives to a lot of charities every year. She gives to her church a lot. Even if we're out downtown or in Boston or something and she sees someone who needs help, she'll help them. She's always generous. And like, we've even seen Gina before, like just totally like volunteer at soup kitchens and stuff. And she doesn't even know that we know about it. So like, she's totally generous. In other words, her intention of generosity drives her good actions. But I got to be honest with you, I have this other friend, Ingrid, and she's a little different. She's a little different. And what she does is she actually is only generous, and I hate to say this because she might see this, Ingrid. She's actually only generous when people are around, when people are watching. That's the only time she's generous, kind of like a Mr. Cabas. But she's only generous when people are watching. And that's when she gives money, and that's when she helps the poor, and that's when she goes to the soup kitchen. In other words, Ingrid is not like a stingy Steve because she does do acts of generosity. But she's also not like a generous Gina. In other words, what's the difference between Ingrid and Gina and Ingrid and stingy Steve? With stingy Steve, the action is different. With Gina, the what is different. The intentionality is different. That's why we call her intentional Ingrid. So intentional Ingrid only does things to be seen, to be noticed, to be thought highly of. Those are her intentions that drive her good acts. We're arguing that habits need to be accompanied by good intentions, that my good external acts shape who I am, intransitive effects. And the better my intention is, the more virtuous I am. Ingrid never develops a habit of generosity because she's missing the intentionality, okay? The object is good, but the intention is not for the good of those in need. So she's not rightly called a generous person because of that. Habits, exterior and interior. Another way to think about this is actually how we act reflects and further ingrains the way we see future situations. So in other words, when Gina goes out and she sees someone on the street struggling, she can actually look at that situation with love and generosity and respond promptly and appropriately. Where when Ingrid, intentional Ingrid, looks at that situation, she actually sees this as an opportunity to look good in front of others. So you can see how habits further ingrain or reflect the way we see things. In other words, do I see this as an opportunity to be loving towards someone? Or do I see this as an opportunity to use someone to boost my own self-esteem in front of others? Ingrid and Gina both have settled ways of acting in similar situations. Right? So Gina's inclined to act this way towards this woman. Ingrid's inclined to act that way towards this woman because of their habits. Habits aren't deterministic. They incline us towards something, but we can act out of character. In other words, if I am a truth teller, which I'm not, I mean, have you spent time with me? But if I was a truth teller, right, I would be inclined to tell the truth given the situation, but I still could act out of characteristic. Out of character. I could act out of character, right? So if you look at, I don't know, we'll say Gian, for example. If Gian said something funny, you would say, wow, that was really out of character for him. Habits become like second nature to us. Right? So the more we do something, the more it becomes second nature to us. And it actually shapes who we are. Right? So some pretty big themes here. So earlier on in the year, what we did was we talked about our goals. What are our purposes? God stuff, family stuff, friend stuff, girlfriend stuff, school stuff, sports stuff, job stuff, work stuff, car stuff, music stuff, party stuff, whatever your hierarchy of goals is. When we pursue those goals intentionally, it shapes who we are. It reveals who we are and what's important to us and builds our character. Those goals or purposes tell us what we're truly all about. Your character tells us who you really are, your habits. So something to think about with those goals or purposes. Again, it's not only what you do, who you are, who you are. So now that we have a good understanding of what a habit is, we can just dig a little more deeply into virtue. And what virtues are good habits. I'll link this video for you, that way you can watch it on your own. What it really does is just gives you an overview of what habits are and then what virtue is. So virtues are good habits. It inclines me to act in a good manner, both externally and internally, with my intention, as we've been talking about. So whenever I hear the word virtue, I think good habits. Generosity, loyalty, trustworthiness, bravery, good reason, patience, gentleness, tenderness, right? These are good habits. He's a guy of justice. Vices are bad habits. Vices incline me to act in a poor manner. I'm a liar. I'm a cheater. I steal. I'm impatient. It's true. So vices are bad habits. So when we have virtue, it changes who we are. It becomes our second nature. Those good habits become part of us. There's a difference between being a virtuous guy and just doing good stuff, right? So a bad person can get you a birthday card and a cupcake and say, have a great day, right? That's a good action. But if they don't have a good interior, if they're not being driven by a good intention, then they're actually not a virtuous person. So again, there's a difference between the particular actions and the stable characteristics or qualities, the good habits that make up who you are. So the sort of person you are may not be accurately represented by a particular action. You think back to the Jordan stuff. Those clips did not accurately represent who he is. In other words, those particular actions did not accurately represent Michael Jordan. So the same could be true for you. If you genuinely and usually tell the truth and you lie in a particular situation, a particular action, that situation does not accurately represent you. Similarly, if you're a liar or you cheat a lot in school, but in this particular action you didn't, well, that doesn't accurately represent who you are either. Right? So let's look at this kid from Portsmouth. If this kid from Portsmouth never hits a basket and this game he hits 3, like all of a sudden he's not a great basketball player. He did well in those particular actions, right? But he would have to do that over and over and over again to have the stable characteristics or qualities. Same with tennis, right? I'm terrible at tennis. If you guys walked by this afternoon and saw me playing tennis and I got a shot down, well, all of a sudden that particular action doesn't accurately represent who I am. What I do over and over again, though, does. So someone could be a good player who reliably hits good shots. and the poor player will not. So it just depends what you see in that particular action. It does not necessarily accurately represent. So virtuous people, when they have goodness, it's within them. It's within their habits rather than simply in the acts. The other thing to keep in mind about virtue is that you actually have virtue even when it's not being exercised. So a way to think about this would be this, is that Mr. Manning, let me just pull this up. Mr. Manning is an exceptional teacher and coach and has been an intricate part of the Hendricken community for many years now. He asked me to read that. But Mr. Manning is one of the great coaches and one of the great teachers. So when Mr. Manning is teaching, he actually still possesses the good characteristics, the stable qualities of being a good coach. When Mr. Manning teaches, he actually still has the characteristics and stable qualities of being a good husband, of being a good friend, a good brother, a good son. And then when he's, when he's at the beach or when he's on the football field or doing track stuff, whatever it is, he actually still has the characteristics of being a good teacher as well. So even when he's not exercising those particular good habits, he's still in possession of them. Okay? So even when he's at the track, even when he's at a cross-country meet, he still possesses the good, stable characteristics or habits of being a good teacher. Virtue, good habits, virtue. Right? Still a good tennis player, even when not playing tennis. You still have good shape, you got good muscle memory, good well-trained eyes, good sense of strategy, and so on. So when Bill Belichick's playing with his grandson, whatever, still a great football coach. He possesses those characteristics. These guys, right, when they're helping their grandmother bake cookies, they still possess the great stable characteristics of being good baseball players. So in the moral life, when we come into situations, when we come to living our day in, day out lives, we don't come to our lives from scratch. Just like the volleyball player doesn't come to a game from scratch, or the baseball player doesn't start every new game from scratch. They've already built habits. The same is true from the moral perspective, that we never start from scratch because our moral life is built on what we've already been doing. In these characteristics, just like in sports, are spreadable to other areas of our lives. So virtues are good habits or skills that can actually be applied to other areas. So in other words, if I have stable characteristics of my school life, I'm always honest, I do my work on time, I listen, I'm punctual, I'm reliable, I'm friendly, I'm generous, I volunteer. Those good habits or stable qualities spread then into you being a good son, you being a good boyfriend, you being a good cousin, you being a good citizen, and so on and so on and so on. So virtues are good habits that spread into other areas of our life, just like it does for the athlete. Right? You think about Timmy Tebow, the great Bo Jackson, right? All-star in both football and baseball because he possesses skills, good habits that can apply to both areas. The same is true for the moral life. It spreads over. So a way to think about this is that the virtuous person will act well in similar situations and into new areas as well because they possess the characteristic. Even if you have no prior experience with it, if you built the habit, you tend to act the same way and you tend to spread that into this new area of your life.